Star Wars Pit Droids is a puzzle game that was developed by LucasLearning and released in 1999 to build off the uncontroversial blockbuster release of the first Star Wars prequel movie. It was also one of the very first video games that I ever played, and if you're wondering if that's had any effect on the sort of games that I enjoy now, probably not. It's not a game that I've ever really heard anyone talk about, although I imagine that is to be expected from a video game made for children that was already quite old by the time I started using the internet. But it is a pity because my memory of this game is that it was actually really quite good. And so when Star Wars Pit Droids was re-released in 2012 as a mobile game on iOS, I thought that was a catastrophic marketing blunder by LucasArts because I am the only human being in the world who wanted to play this game, and I have never owned an iPhone. But more recently I decided I did want to try it again. This was a game that I remember was a real challenge as a child, and I thought it would be interesting to play as an adult who enjoys puzzle video games. Unfortunately, there is the problem of how to get a game running that's over 20 years old, designed for older operating systems and not currently being sold anywhere, but I found my way around that. And I'm glad I did, because you know what? Star Wars Pit Droids is still a pretty good game. I was expecting something fairly simple that I could power through quite easily, but actually at times the game still posed quite a challenge, and by the later stages, I did have to properly think about almost every puzzle. And looking back at the reception of the game at release, it was credited as being a fun game for puzzle fans of all ages. Or as that would probably be put in this day and age,
it is a little something for everyone.
There's a great line in the game's Wikipedia entry which says that Star Wars Pit Droids was nominated for Best Game at the Cody Awards in 1999, but lost to Half-Life. And there's something funny about the idea of those two games even competing. In one corner you've got a video gaming icon, a game that was at one point the best-selling first-person shooter of all time, and in the other corner you've got Star Wars Pit Droids, a movie tie-in educational puzzle game that I'm still not fully convinced isn't a figment of my imagination. It feels like those two games shouldn't be competing for the same award, but what's actually even funnier is that that line in the Wikipedia entry is wrong. Star Wars Pit Droids didn't lose to Half-Life. They tied. And so this is the Star Wars puzzle game for children that's officially as good as Half-Life. So, what is this game for all the people out there who haven't played it, which I assume is probably all of you? Star Wars Pit Droids is set 32 years before the Battle of Yavin, where the first Death Star was destroyed. I don't see how that information is of use to anyone, but I read it on the Star Wars wiki, and now you've heard it from me. The theme of the game is that Watto, this guy, has bought a huge hauler of pit droids at a massive discount and needs you to get them from the transport ship through the various regions of Tatooine and over to the Mos Espa Grand Arena, and you'll do this by solving puzzles. The goal of every puzzle in Star Wars Pit Droids is to place directional arrows on the ground to redirect pit droids from these mechanical launcher contraption things into these storage holes in the ground. To win a level, you have to get every single droid into one of the goals, sometimes meeting other criteria along the way. When a droid walks over an arrow, it turns and starts walking in the direction the arrow points, and it continues until it reaches an obstacle or another arrow. But it wouldn't be much of a puzzle game if all you had to do was draw a line from start to finish. Any game like that certainly wouldn't be an acclaimed puzzle masterpiece like Star Wars Pit Droids. So instead you have to deal with a variety of droids. Droids come in different combinations of body colour and head colour and with different equipment. Most levels will have obstacles that won't allow droids to pass unless they have particular attributes, or goals that can only be filled by particular types of droid. In your inventory you'll be given special arrows that only interact with one type, and so the basic foundation of most puzzles is creating specific routes for different droid types to move through different parts of the same level. So in this tutorial puzzle run by everyone's favourite Star Trek character R2-D2, the launcher is pointed directly at the level's only goal, but there are two obstacles in the way which block droids that are either red or holding oil cans. But the oil can droids can go this way, and so they get redirected with a special arrow, and it's the same here for the droids that are red. So these two droid types can go off to the side and loop round and then meet up with all of the others at the goal. Simple. It is a tutorial puzzle. In the real game you could have puzzles like this about filtering droids from one launcher but in slightly more complex situations. Or you could have a few different launchers each with a different type of droid that all need to be manoeuvred into different goals. Or you could have multiple launchers each throwing out a variety of droids that all need to be filtered and then recombined with one another so that they can be filtered again, and all you're given to do it is ratio arrows, but I'm getting way ahead of myself there. It's also worth pointing out that in Star Wars Pit Droids I always try to solve the puzzle in one go. Pressing play in a puzzle starts the launchers and gets the droids moving, but after you do that you are still allowed to place and move arrows. This means that you can fix a mistake or use arrows multiple times if you needed more than the level gave you. This also technically means that any puzzles where the droids can't crash can actually be solved with a single white arrow, like this. And that honestly took way too long, it was not worth it for one line in the video. As far as I can tell, you can solve every level without moving any arrows after launching the droids, and this felt slightly more natural compared to modern puzzle games, and so for the extra challenge I decided not to use this mechanic. The idea of filtering droids is like 90% of Star Wars Pit Droids, but within that there are a lot of ways that it's made more difficult. Each level has an inventory of arrows and you might only have a small number to play around with, or maybe in a level there's only a small amount of space to work in. There could be a large number of obstacles requiring a lot of distinct paths or just a large amount of visual complexity. I also thought it was neat that the game switches between square and hexagonal grids to make different puzzles, whereas I feel like building around one of these would be the more normal thing to do. Something I hadn't remembered from playing the game as a child that I thought was interesting is that what a lot of the puzzles require you to think about is timing. The puzzles in Pit Droids run in discrete turns, where a droid takes one turn to walk one tile. The launchers can release droids into a level every turn, but also every 2, 3, or 4 turns. If you have 2 launchers releasing droids every other turn, then it means you can thread both streams together without making them crash into one another, or crash every single droid together if you do it wrong. When levels become more complicated, you'll have droids crossing over one another all the time, and I can clearly see the moments in the footage where I'm counting out the number of tiles a droid will walk to make sure that it won't collide into one from another launcher. You also have to do this when puzzles involve floor fans, which are obstacles that alternate open and close and break any droids that walk over them at the wrong time. There are 2 other types of arrows, one I've already mentioned, limited arrows which only redirect a specific number of droids before deactivating, and ratio arrows. Technically there's a 3rd type, mystery arrows, but I saw these in one training puzzle and then never again, so I assume they were binned at some point for just being a little bit rubbish. The limited number arrows are where you can really see the LucasLearning roots. They're making children do basic maths, and there is a limit to how intricate these puzzles can be. That can't be said about ratio arrows. While also clearly being something included just to match with some sort of education curriculum, the LucasLearning design ethos, ratios are just more complicated to think about. It's simple, say if you need to split 8 droids into one goal and 4 into another, because that's a simple 2-to-1 ratio. But there could be another step before where you have to get those 12 initial droids in the first place. And maybe the goals don't require specific quantities but specific types of droid, and so you need to figure out if there's a pattern from the launchers that you can separate by ratio. But maybe there isn't a pattern, so can you make one? Maybe if you took these droids out of this line and fed them into the other one, but what pattern would that make, and how would you do that? And what happens when you split them again later down the line and then need to split them once more? And now you don't have enough arrows, and there isn't enough space to do that anyway. And while that is about the pinnacle of the difficulty, when I installed this game out of a sense of nostalgia, I did not expect to be getting stumped by a puzzle game made for children. Despite being a game made by LucasLearning, there is a genuine complexity to be found in Star Wars Pit Droids, and enough variety in the puzzle design for the game to stay interesting. In some of the levels you would quickly figure out the correct idea, the way that it or a part of it must work, and then the challenge would be in the practicalities of the timing and exact pathing. But sometimes figuring out the core trick to a puzzle was the difficult part, and you'd spend a few minutes not even close to the solution. And those are 2 very different types of thinking. One that's more logical and one that's a little more outside the box, and it works having both in the game to switch up the type of mental load. There are also quite a lot of very simple puzzles for the lower end of the target audience, but unless you opt for easy, these won't make up much of your playtime, and as you progress through the 8 stages, the number of trivial puzzles diminishes pretty quickly. The 8 stages are the locations between the hangar and the grand arena, and these are what make up the game's sort of campaign. To progress to the next zone, you have to deliver 144 droids. Puzzles contain 48 droids, and so you need to finish 3 puzzles per zone. In order to experience more of the game, I insisted on moving all 480 droids that I started with, making it 10 puzzles per level. This is also the reason I selected medium, because in difficult you only start with 240 droids, which means fewer puzzles, and because you play more puzzles on medium, you end up playing the harder puzzles anyway. Those 10 puzzles won't be the same every time. The game has a pool of puzzles for each zone that you can see in the level selector menu, and when you click to start the next level during the campaign, you just seem to get one picked semi-randomly from this list, generally easier ones to begin with and then more difficult later on. This design ends up having some advantages. The random puzzle selection did a good job of creating a nice rhythm, albeit accidentally. Instead of having too many lengthy puzzles back to back, you were much more likely to have that broken up by something a bit different or a bit simpler. Puzzles like the chasms, which are large chunks of fixed colour arrows to send the droids across, and mazes where you have to work back from the goal to find the only possible path through. Those are neat palette cleansers in between harder levels that individually might take half an hour each. There genuinely were puzzles that took more than half an hour, which I think is a combination of there being some clever planning involved, but also the fact that placing arrows and watching the droids to test solutions is a longer process than you might get in other puzzle games, say pushing around some wooden crates. This design also creates a pretty user-friendly, modern-feeling difficulty mode. As more and more puzzle developers are realising, having a single puzzle determine player progress is something that doesn't really work. Knocking your head against a wall for 10 minutes can be a fun part of a puzzle game, but at some point the player needs to have an option to do something else, and ideally for player retention, that should just be a different puzzle to make progress in a different way. If you quit out of a puzzle in the Star Wars Pit Droids campaign, when you go back in you will be given a different puzzle. The only times I did this were when I was in the middle of a puzzle and needed to stop to do something else, like sleeping, but it does have the potential to allow players to skip over challenges that are too difficult or taking too long, effectively creating a self-regulating dynamic difficulty level. And it's the same for the play and pause buttons. If you want to move arrows around during a puzzle, you can to make a level easier, or to finish off the last few moves of a puzzle that's already taken 35 minutes. I'm sorry, I caved. But if you don't think that approach is quite as satisfying, you can just not. It has the feel of pretty modern, user-friendly design. On top of the gameplay, Star Wars Pit Droids is also pretty good from an artistic standpoint. I'm not going to insult anyone's intelligence by explaining the ways in which this game doesn't look good. It's from 1999 and it's locked to a full-screen 640 by 480 resolution, which also makes it a fairly difficult game to record. At least I didn't cut off the screen during any of it. Damn it. The game does, however, have the advantage of taking its visual design from an IP with a much larger budget and pre-existing ideas to base all its assets around. And so you've got the Pit Droids, which are quite fun characters to have en masse moving around the screen, and look, some of them even do a little flip. The visual clarity is also great, except in the levels where it's designed not to be, and the bright colours of the droids and obstacles give the game a fun, light-hearted appearance over the more neutral backgrounds. Although, the balance of having one grey metallic section on the transport ship and then 7 sections in the desert maybe could have been tipped a little more equal. I think the only downside visually is that due to the game's isometric viewpoint, any details which make up the environment and the backgrounds to a level can sometimes obscure the puzzle that you're trying to solve. There is a solution to this in the game, and you can flatten all of these objects down to black markings on the floor, but that does mean that a fair chunk of the art assets won't ever be visible for more than the first few seconds of a level. While the visuals are handicapped by 20-year-old resolutions, the music has no such issue, and in this movie tie-in puzzle game made for children, we really have to ask ourselves one question. Why is the soundtrack so good? I have played a lot of puzzle games with well-composed soundtracks, but none that have had me actually snapping my fingers to the music while I was playing. I think the best way to show off a soundtrack is always to just play a few clips from it, and so this is now that section. It is outrageous how good this soundtrack is for an educational puzzle video game. It was so difficult picking out which tracks to highlight in the video because I thought, gotta include that one to all of them. The original tracks for Star Wars Pit Droids were composed by Peter McConnell and Michael Land, and it turns out that McConnell also worked on the soundtracks for all the Sly Cooper sequels, both Psychonauts titles, and wrote music for Hearthstone. A pretty good track record following on from this. Together they also worked on various other LucasArts projects, including many of the Monkey Island sequels. And I suppose that kind of answers the question. This was a LucasArts or LucasLearning game, and so the company had the pull and the money to get talented people working on the sound design from the composing to the editing, and the result is something excellent. I think if Star Wars Pit Droids were to be released today rather than in 1999, it would have a few tweaks made to it in terms of quality of life. What you might have seen in the footage that I hadn't explicitly mentioned is that every time you want to place an arrow in this game, you have to fish it out of the inventory, drag it over to where you need it, and then select a direction, which is a pretty tedious thing to do when you've just got to make an obvious path around a bunch of corners. And I think for sure that if this game were to be made today, you would have keyboard shortcuts for arrow placement and rotation. The camera can also be a bit unwieldy, and on some of the larger levels, it never quite zooms out as far as you might want it to. But I suppose when you have so few pixels to play with, you can't go too far out without the droids just turning into coloured blocks. A slightly more specific quality of life feature that this game would possibly have had if it were published now is something highlighting any placed arrows that the droids simply cannot walk over. Because actually, if you've put like 40 identical white arrows down on the ground, it can be easy to lose one that was placed by accident and then spend another 20 minutes failing to solve a puzzle because you needed one more arrow. That's just a hypothetical, of course. I would never do something so stupid. It would also be neat to have some sort of tracked progress to show how many of the 300 plus puzzles in the game you've actually solved, and if you want to know how many 300 plus is, it's 403. Counted it myself. But there were a small number of puzzles that maybe should have been curated out for one reason or another. This puzzle on the screen has 2 rings of filter obstacles and all the goals in the middle, and long story short, the solution relies on the exact order of the droids from all 4 of the launchers, and so in practice it is simply trial and error. There were also a handful of puzzles where you didn't have to use one of the goals in the level, or you could solve it with less than half of the available arrows, and if this were a modern puzzle game, I think those might have been tightened up a bit. Overall though, I enjoyed Star Wars Pit Droids more than I think I was expecting to. It wasn't just interesting because of the nostalgia, it was genuinely an interesting design to play around with that could still, at times, pose a decent challenge. It's certainly not perfect and does have some of that 90s video game clunkiness, and the low fixed resolution isn't ideal, but neither was a deal breaker in terms of this being a playable and enjoyable game. It is a shame that this game doesn't really exist anywhere, and keeping games available longer term is something that I hope video games, especially licensed ones, improve at in the future. There were pit droids in The Mandalorian, so I think that's enough for a re-release, right? Anyway, I enjoy going back and playing Star Wars Pit Droids, and hopefully it's something interesting to see, even if I think it's unlikely that many people will actually go and play it. Though if you do, it's not overly difficult to get running, and you may well get a few hours of fun out of it. I'm sure the next video will be on something that wasn't from the previous millennium, hopefully, and also it definitely won't be a puzzle game because I realise I've just done 3 puzzle games in a row. But thank you for watching anyway, and hopefully I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.